This happened about a week ago or so. I recently started going to school again, and as part of my daily schedule, I'm required to travel to Toronto Monday through Friday via the train and subway lines. It's about a good 2 hours one way, so I usually pull out a good book, pop in my headphones and relax to some light music. I, of course, being from out of town, have heard a lot of horror stories that many people endure on the Toronto Transit Commission. Naturally, I thought most of it was just over-exaggeration and tall tales. Well, I was quickly proven dead wrong. Rewind to a week ago. I had just finished a very long, grueling day of school spanning from 5 a.m. to 7 p.m., and I wanted nothing more than to just relax and get home ASAP. I took my usual bus route to the subway station and sat down on one of the seats directly next to an exit door. Now, a little bit of context. I'm facing forwards, looking at one seat ahead of me across the aisle of the subway car. The seat was occupied by a 20-something Asian lady who was playing some game on her phone and was paying absolutely no attention to anything going on around her. Next to this seat opposite me was another person facing this Asian lady, and it's the person in this seat that made my 40-minute subway ride very disturbing. Occupying the seat was a lady of about 30 or 40 years of age who possessed a very creepy smile. I say this because she never stopped smiling, and I mean she was smiling the entire subway ride. Anyways, the car pulled out of the station, and we were on our way. For the first half of my trip, the smiling woman would continuously be staring at this Asian lady, laughing and muttering to herself. The smiling woman even took her phone out of her purse and began taking pictures of this lady and whatever was on her phone. How she didn't see the smiling woman doing any of this, I still have no clue. My only guess is that she was ignoring all of it as to not provoke her. About halfway up the tracks, the Asian lady left the car, and that's when this smiling woman's attention was directed towards me. She turned full front to me and just smiled with a huge toothy grin. I knew deep down that if I made eye contact, I was going to be in for a bad time. So I just stared at a poster on the roof of the train for what felt like hours. Eventually she got the hint that I was avoiding her gaze like the plague, and went on to plan B. She opened up her purse and removed a tube of toothpaste, and proceeded to ingest roughly half the tube. I damn near threw up then and there, but I somehow held it together, even though she was still staring and laughing at me covered in toothpaste. My stop came, and I bolted from that car as fast as I could. I got to the escalator and hazarded a glance back, and guess who I see fast walking after me, arms at her side, still smiling. I was understandably terrified by this point. I ran out of that station and right to the bus just as it was pulling out. I took one final look back, and there she was, standing on the platform, head cocked to the side, laughing and waving goodbye. So in short, that's the story of how I lost 5 pounds of sweat and ran faster than Usain Bolt. Many years ago, I got my first bachelor apartment. It was a basement unit in a 2-story walk-up on the edge of my town's campus, so naturally, it was an eclectic mix of wealth and poverty. I was somewhere closer to the latter. This place was tiny, with a mattress on the floor against one wall. I could lie on the floor, feet against the edge of the mattress, and touch the far wall with my fingertips, so there wasn't much space. The kitchenette was to the right of my apartment door, and there was a tiny bathroom in the back. One night at around 4 a.m., I began to hear growling, and because my apartment was so small and so dark, it sounded like the growling was coming from inside of my apartment. This growling sounded angry, like a hurt animal growling on the other side of my living room. I lay there under my blankets terrified. The growling went on for almost 30 minutes and would only get louder and more angry, then taper off a little, then get louder and angrier and more high-pitched, like a wail or shriek. Finally, I began to hear scratching on my door, and the growling stopped as well. Later, I found out that there was no one in my apartment. There never was. Turns out it was my next-door neighbor, and apparently she believed she was possessed. She did this a few more times. She would lie on the floor outside of my apartment door in the hallway, out of sight from my peephole, so I couldn't see her. I could only hear the growling and murmuring of something that wasn't English, and this always happened well into the night. I had no phone, and ours were the only apartments in the basement, as the rest of it was for the furnace, water heaters, and storage. So when I wanted to go out, I had to pass her apartment, which started becoming a terrifying task. Every time I needed to leave home, it got to the point where I had to tiptoe past her door, because if she did hear me, she would rush to her front door and start banging on it, shrieking and cursing until I was far enough away that I couldn't hear her. I spoke with the landlord, and he said that she was fine as far as his experiences with her were concerned. In his own words, she was a lovely, quiet woman who kept to herself. Of course, because we were the only tenants on that floor, no one else ever heard what was going on, so it was her word against mine. About a month after speaking with the landlord about her, she accidentally set fire to her apartment cooking toast. She just put the bread on the burner and forgot about it and set a small fire. Nobody was badly hurt, but the building was evacuated, and she was sent to the hospital with smoke inhalation and was released the next day. When the fire department went in to assess the damage, they discovered that she had written on every square inch of her apartment walls in small, neatly written cursive handwriting, vague religious scripture-style verses, apparently in an attempt to keep the demons contained. I moved out at the end of that month and never looked back. I heard through a friend that she was diagnosed with severe schizophrenic disorder and was put on a heavy course of medication to deal with it. To this day, I wouldn't know her if I passed her in the street, as I never once saw the woman who would become feral and lay growling and shrieking outside my door. I only ever heard her, and that alone was enough to scare the living crap out of me. I was 22 when this happened, and in my final year of college, I'd been living in a loft apartment that was the third floor of a house. Two other couples lived in the apartments below me. I lived just off campus in what's called a cusp neighborhood, which is basically a safer, more family-oriented area. Since my apartment was on the third floor, the door I used was around the back with 2 flights of stairs going up to my apartment door. Also, my bedroom was at the front of the house, with 2 big windows that faced the street. Well, one night I was coming back from working on my thesis with a classmate at her apartment. It was late, somewhere around midnight, and I drove down my street to find parking. I lived in a cul-de-sac with a dead end, so I turned around when I didn't see parking and decided to park on the main street that ran perpendicular to mine. I had done this many times before and walked to my apartment late at night on multiple occasions, and I always felt safe. After I got out of my car, I pulled out 2 heavy bags, and then I noticed a man standing in the street. He was about 40 feet away, and his face was sort of covered by shadow, but he was facing me, and I could tell he was staring at me. He seemed to be in his 30s and was wearing regular-looking clothes and had a dog that looked to be a beagle next to him. Normally I would just shrug it off as some guy out walking his dog, no biggie, but I still had one of those really bad gut feelings that there was something up with this guy, and here's why. First of all, he pretty much seemed to appear out of nowhere. I'd been driving up and down the street and I didn't see anyone, and I was actively looking around to find a parking space, so I would have seen if someone was walking down the street. Second, he was just standing there facing me, and if he were walking his dog, shouldn't he be doing the obvious, like walking? Then the last thing that to me was the creepiest. He was standing in the middle of the street, not by one of the sidewalks on either side, but smack dab in the middle, like he was trying to block the street. I fumbled for my keys to lock my car, and I noticed him still standing there staring. I knew I had to walk by him to get to my apartment, so I was starting to get pretty creeped out by this point. Not to mention his dog was just as frozen as he was, not moving, and also staring at me. So I sort of half smiled in his direction and said, "Hello?" pretty loudly, trying to show confidence and that I wasn't scared of him. I started walking as far to the left side of the street as I could, making sure my house key was ready to go so I could unlock my door quickly. My house was 4 houses down from the top of the street, and there's a small street lamp in front of my neighbor's house that kept it from being totally dark. The man still hadn't said anything in return, and I was avoiding eye contact, trying to look straight ahead. Something possessed me to glance at him, and I wish I hadn't. When I looked to my right, he was grinning at me with this really sinister-looking grin. The only thing moving was his head as he followed me. I snapped my head back and increased my speed, trying to mentally locate where my phone was in my bag if I had to call 911. When I got to my house, I turned left to take the little path leading to where my door was, and quickly glanced back to see if he was following me. He was directly under my neighbor's street lamp like a spotlight about 15 feet from me, just standing there with his frozen dog still staring and still smiling. At this point, I just bolted to my door. It wasn't well lit by any means, and I couldn't see whether or not he was going to follow me to the door. I unlocked the door as fast as I could, slammed it behind me and deadbolted it shut. I turned off the stair light because I didn't want him to see me through the window at the second floor landing and know which floor I lived on. I fumbled up the stairs to my apartment door, unlocked it, and turned off all the lights in my apartment. I crept into my bedroom and thanked God that I had drawn the blinds before I left. I made a little hole in them with my fingers to look outside, and much to my horror, he was standing in the middle of the street again, directly in front of my house, looking up at my window, still smiling, and this time waving. I freaked out and grabbed my phone from my bag and called my father. I was in hysterics, telling him what was happening. He told me to calm down and to make sure all my doors and windows were locked and to call campus police. I called them, and this time much more calmly explained my ordeal. By this time, I felt safe enough to look out the window again, and I didn't see him. They eventually came about half an hour later, took my statement and searched for the guy, who of course they never found. They did say, however, that there were boot prints in the dirt by my back door, as well as the same prints in the side garden my neighbors who lived on the first floor kept. The garden was on the other side of the house, right under one of their windows. Needless to say, I made sure both of my first and second floor neighbors were warned about this creep. I think the thing that creeps me out the most is that I never actually saw this man move anywhere. It seemed like he was just appearing and disappearing. I never heard footsteps or any indication that he had moved closer to me, and every time I saw him, he was just standing there with his dog who wasn't moving either, not a sound from either of them. That smile still gives me the shivers.